can a high-fat diet cause issues with your cognitive function? Will a third of all children in the world be obese by the year 2050, which is only 25 years away? And if you have a Western diet during pregnancy, is your child more likely to have ADHD? These are what the 3 research papers I will be going through today will discuss, and as you can see, 3 very different topics today, but all things that I feel people should be aware of. Welcome to episode 5 of Research Roundup, where I explain and sum up the latest health research so that you don't have to. Let's go. Now, early this year, a research study was published that aimed to look into how a high-fat diet might impact on brain function and inflammation. Previous research has found that having obesity might be linked to memory decline and inflammation within the brain. But at this stage, it's still a bit unclear how quickly these changes can take place and whether they actually start in the brain. And so this study wanted to answer these questions. So here is the study on the screen now, and as usual, links to all of the studies that I talk about will be in the description. Now, this research was done on rats. It was an animal study. And they had 2 groups of rats. They had a young group and then they had an old group to sort of symbolize young adults, older adults. They fed the high-fat diet to these rats for either 3 days, which would be considered a short term, or 3 months, which is considered long-term in the lifespan of these rats. Now, high-fat in this case was a diet where 60% of total energy came from fat, and the usual diet that was used here was 17% of energy coming from fat. Now, it's important to note that the high-fat diet used for this study and given to the rats was also high in added sugars, so I would call it high-fat, high sugar. So what did they find? Well, after just 3 days of having the high-fat diet, the older rats showed signs of memory issues and anxiety-like behaviors. And these effects actually lasted for 3 months, even though the rats were only given the diet for 3 days. So this tells us that a high-fat diet might have very quick, but also long-lasting impacts on your brain function. Now, when they looked at the brains of these older rats, they did also find that there were more signs of inflammation in the hippocampus and the amygdala. Now, these are simply just regions within the brain that are important for forming memories. So inflammation here is bad in terms of memory formation. The older rats on the high-fat diet for 3 days seem to only have the brain effects. They did not have changes to weight or their blood sugar levels. On the other hand, the group that had the high-fat diet for 3 months, they had weight gain, they had insulin resistance, and more inflammation around the body. So what does this all mean? It means that if you have a high-fat diet, your brain might get impacted before the other areas in your body, which is surprising because I think many people think weight gain and heart issues may come around first, but this research is suggesting otherwise. But the scary thing about this study was that the short-term changes to diet might have long-lasting effects. Just 3 days of a high-fat diet was enough to cause memory issues and increase brain inflammation, which lasted 3 months. That's probably the most concerning thing in this study. Age did matter here. The group of young rats did not seem to experience these brain impacts. No memory loss, no brain inflammation. But the older rats, they were much more at risk. So what we can take from this is that maybe in older human adults, even short periods of having a high-fat diet could impact on brain function. So it wouldn't be 3 days in humans, it would be a little longer than that, but the 3 days was just meant to say short term. Now obviously this is an animal study, it was done on rats, and this hasn't been proven in adults or human adults yet, but rats are picked for a reason. They do have a large similarity to humans in terms of metabolism, aging, and their brains, but the clear next step here would be to see if we can do some human studies. These are just very hard to do. And from these animal studies, though, we can take their findings on board. just from this paper, if you're an older adult, it might be a good idea to consume less fat. Now, the type of fat does matter here. The high-fat diets that the rats were given were relatively high in saturated fat, and they were low in polyunsaturated fat. So quite simply, what we'd want to do is lower the fats that are worse for your health, and this would be things like saturated fats, trans fats, and then try to increase the more healthier fats, which we know are the polyunsaturated ones, your omega-3s, your omega-6s. That would be the best way to go. All right, now onto the next piece of research, which has a bit more of a depressing undertone. So this was published a week ago, and it was basically looking at global trends to see how the world is going in terms of overweight and obesity in children and what the numbers might look like heading into 2050. So this was quite in depth. The researchers looked into 180 countries, but they also focused on 2 age groups. They looked at young children between the ages of 5 to 14 years old, and then they looked at older adolescents who were between 15 to 24 years old. So young adults are included in that. So here's what they found. Obesity in children had tripled since the year 1990. So as of 2021, 93 million children between the ages of 5 and 14 years old were obese, and 80 million 15 to 24-year-olds were obese. And again, this is triple what it was in 1990. And so if we keep this trend going, it's expected that by 2050, this number will be about 360 million young people being obese. Now, the interesting thing here is where in the world these rates are highest. Now, according to this research, it's expected that the highest rates of obesity in 2050 will be in North Africa, the Middle East, and the Cook Islands and American Samoa. That doesn't mean other countries are safe. These are just the highest rates. But you can see from this, there's been a little shift, because it used to be countries like the United States, United Kingdom, the more Western countries that had the highest rates of obesity, and we can see this now shifting. There are some regions in the world, though, where children used to be more overweight than they were obese, and that has now flipped, which means we have more obese children than overweight children, which can tell us that things are getting a little bit worse. And those countries were here in Australia, also Canada, the United Arab Emirates, and Qatar. The crisis group, though, are these 5 to 14-year-old children. They are at higher risk of tipping into being obese rather than overweight. And I just find this whole paper scary, to be honest, because from what I recall, for at least the last decade, realistically probably even longer, I would say probably 20 years or so, there has been a huge emphasis on preventing and tackling the issue of obesity. It's been public health enemy number one. And to see that Australia and all these other countries are still on the list of countries where things are getting worse, something clearly just isn't working here. Now, this study also seems to say that the years 2022 to 2030 will see the most dramatic increases in childhood obesity. So we are literally in the middle of that. And I don't know what to say here, other than clearly the strategies being used to target this are not working. Obesity in general is a huge health-related risk factor, and if you are an adult and you have obesity, then your risk for other health conditions is increased. But it's even worse for obese children. Their risk of experiencing health conditions when they become adults, things like heart disease, type 2 diabetes, the risk that these children will experience these in their adult life is even higher. It really just sets them on the back foot for their health. So I still think prevention is the key here, but something just isn't working. I see stats and numbers like the ones given on this in this study, and it just feels like an impossible task. But this channel that I have is here to help people learn how to change their lifestyles to prevent these chronic conditions, and I'm hoping in a few years, I can say I made some contribution to stopping this problem, because so much of it is preventable. If there are any parents out there watching, children tend to do what they see, so it's in your best interest to also live a lifestyle that helps prevent these conditions. I don't think the problem is just children. I think literally everyone needs to work on their lifestyle. There is no age that this doesn't benefit you, from children to adults to older adults. I've mentioned it quite a few times on the channel already. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the last study now. Last episode, I talked about a study that looked into whether having paracetamol during pregnancy increases the risk of the child that is born having ADHD. And this week there is more ADHD research. This time it looked into whether a mother following a Western diet was more likely to have a child with ADHD or autism. Now, I was pretty excited for this study because I have always felt that the typical Western diet that we have nowadays may be playing some sort of role in this increase we are seeing in children with ADHD and autism. I don't think it's the only reason, but I think it makes sense that it's involved. So I was just keen to see what this study found. And I'm noticing there's been quite a lot of research in terms of what is happening during pregnancy that may impact on ADHD and autism. So that's just something I've observed. Now, this study was done in Denmark. They managed to include over 60,000 pairs of mothers and children, so it's a pretty sizable amount. And they looked at the mothers' eating patterns, some blood samples, and ADHD or autism diagnoses within the children. And what they found was that the more of a Western diet that a woman followed, the more likely it was that her child developed ADHD or autism. Now, what does a Western diet mean? It means it is a diet that is high in fat, high in sugar, high in refined products, but also being low in vegetables, fruits, fish, things like that. They looked at following a Western diet as a spectrum, and it seems that even if you have a slight deviation being towards a Western diet, there was a 66% increase in risk of the child developing ADHD and a 122% increase in the risk of the child developing autism. Now, this does sound scary, and to be honest, it is. But the good news is that it means that a slight deviation away from a Western diet will have large benefits too. Now, it does seem to be that the most risk is during early to mid-pregnancy. So that would probably be the first 2 trimesters, and that might be because the brain development of the fetus is quite sensitive to the nutrition of the mother during this time. Now, it is important to note this is an observational study. It does show a strong association, but it does not conclusively prove that a Western diet can cause ADHD or autism. That would be a very bold claim. We also need to keep in mind with studies like this, where we get information on a person's diet, the researchers use self-reported questionnaires, which means that they rely on the person to remember how often they eat certain foods. And it might not be the most accurate way. It may not capture everything they usually eat. It's just not the best picture of someone's diet. Also, we just can't ignore the fact that genetics play a huge role in ADHD and autism. It has what is called an 80% heritability, which is very large when looking at how much of a role genes play in certain conditions. So we do have to keep that in mind, and it's why I said diet likely plays a role, but it's not the only cause. Nutrition during pregnancy can be quite challenging for many women. Nutrient requirements change, so keeping up with all that is a bit stressful. And then there's also the stress of wondering if everything is going to be okay for the child. So general rules can be followed though. It's good to try to avoid high sugar foods, high saturated fat foods, and emphasize on fruits and vegetables where possible too. None of this stuff is particularly new. It's just quite hard to stick to and actually do the behavior changes if this isn't already how you eat. But as I always say, small changes is the best way to go. Start with one thing, try and get a hold of it and do it for a long period of time, and then you can slowly stack those changes. The tiniest change could make all the difference as well, but also you'll find that once you make that small change, you may feel better. That gives you the momentum to make more changes. So that wraps up this episode. I actually found all of the studies this week super interesting, so I had more fun than usual making this video. I hope you got something out of it too. Comment if you want anything explained further or just what your thoughts are on these studies. I will see you in the next video, and until then, keep playing the long game.